In 1998, one game was about to set the bar for the storytelling FPS genre as we know it. The name of that game was Half-Life.
Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System.
The scientific-themed based first-person shooter broke new ground with its graphics, cinematic scripted set pieces, and excellent story. Developed by Valve, Half-Life, you could argue, was just another Doom clone, but in reality was anything but. It took the FPS formula and added a compelling story and puzzle elements, and it ultimately defined its own genre. The game has no levels or maps. It was a start-to-finish story told in chapters, and other than short loading pauses, there are no levels. There's also no cutscenes, only scripted sequences where you had full control of Gordon Freeman, the main protagonist in first-person mode. Many of the bosses needed puzzles to figure out how to defeat them rather than by direct confrontation. The introduction of the Marines later on in the game showed off some of the best AI at the time. Compared to Quake 2, where enemies would simply just duck or sidestep gunfire, Marines would flank your position, lob grenades in your location. Enemies would also work together in packs and show fear. All this sounds like nothing special, but in 1998, this was unparalleled. The story of Half-Life was written by sci-fi novelist Mark Laidlaw, and he worked closely with the development team to implement ideas into the story as set pieces in the game. The most popular being the train ride introduction into the Black Mesa. Make no mistake, Half-Life is a masterpiece. In 1998, it far exceeded expectations and was miles ahead of everything else. The game to this day has a 96% Metacritic score, and it frequents best ever games of all time lists.
And they have authorized me to offer you a job. They agree with me that you have limitless potential.
It was only 6 months after the release of Half-Life where work began on a sequel. It was to be bigger and more ambitious, with a new engine developed specifically for the game. The technology would not only take advantage of advanced rendering techniques, it introduced human emotions, particle effects, water, dynamic shadows, and advanced physics. Known as the Source Engine, it was built to be fast, reliable, and flexible, all available for developers to build complex 3D scenes and not worry too much about performance tuning. Rumours of Half-Life 2 being in development started around 2002, 4 years after Half-Life, and in March of 2003, Gabe Newell, president of Valve, dropped a bombshell that the game would be launched at E3 of that year and released on September 30th. This was a promise to the fans. Valve wasn't big on the when it's done approach like other teams like id Software. Instead, they preferred to announce the game release when things were just about buttoned up. In May of 2003 at E3, a tech demo for Half-Life 2 was shown off and the hype was incredible. It won the coveted Best of E3 award for that year, but some press were skeptical at what they saw. This was a tech demo and wondered if the game would actually ship by September 30. Internally, the game was under heavy crunch. Gabe Newell realised after the E3 show that September 30 would be aggressive, and he wondered if his team would actually get there. In July of 2003, the game's publisher Vivendi Universal announced that Half-Life 2 would ship sometime during the holiday season, effectively delaying the game. But Valve's promise was September 30, and they did not respond to the Vivendi Universal announcement. But on September 23rd, 1 week before launch, Valve confirmed that the game would indeed be delayed. When this announcement came out, fans of the game were upset. In the past, Gabe Newell would frequent forums and converse with fans, even chat with them on long phone calls. But during development of Half-Life 2, Gabe Newell went all but silent. And when the delay was confirmed, the fans were stunned. This false sense of hope was not received well, and they wanted answers. Was Half-Life 2 real? Was it anywhere near completion? No one really knew outside of Valve, except for one person. Axel Gembe from Germany would soon find out the answers. Axel was a massive fan of Valve and idolized Gabe Newell. He wanted to know more about Half-Life 2 and possibly learn information that no one else knew about. Gembe wondered what it would take to hack into the Valve network and see if he could uncover something, anything about the game. Gembe had learnt his craft by being a victim of hacking himself. By downloading malware that was disguised as a key generator for Warcraft 3, it ended up being an SD bot, which is a worm that allows a remote attacker full access to the victim's machine. It uses the IRC protocol to work, and effectively sends back a list of all the victim's information, including a logger, back to the IRC channel. But rather than wipe his computer and reformat, he reverse engineered the Trojan, found the IRC channel that the SD bot was sending back its information to, and then chat with the moderators on the channel and ask questions about the malware itself. Armed with this information, Genbei then coded his own malware that would steal CD keys from games that he wanted to play. But he wasn't doing this to sell for profit, rather to play the games for himself. After the delay of Half-Life 2, Genbei wondered if he could find out more about the game and thought it might be worth a try to see if he could break into Valve's network and see if he could get some information. Initially, he port scanned Valve's network for any opening, but it was secured rather well. But thanks to their DNS server allowing for anonymous zone transfers, he was able to discover all the subdomain names at Valve. During the scan, he found a different network range that belonged to another company known as Tengus, which was also hosted on Valve's network. Tengus was founded by Dan Newell, brother of Gabe. The company was developing wearable technology. Tengus' server would be the weak point that Axel was looking for. He discovered one of the web servers had a writable web root, which meant that he could easily upload ASP scripts and execute them directly on the web server. From here, he was able to connect to Valve's primary domain controller, dumped all the usernames and hash passwords, and with a little bit of effort, he was able to crack the entire password list without too much trouble. At this point, he had complete and unrestricted access to Valve's network. Genbei used proxy servers to cover his location and started snooping around the network, and he uncovered design documents about the game that he wanted to learn so much about, Half-Life 2. This went on for weeks. No one at Valve was aware of what was going on. Eventually, he found the Half-Life 2 source code and he was able to download it. It wasn't long before the Half-Life 2 source code leaked onto the internet, specifically on BitTorrent sites, and there it spread like wildfire. Genbei denies leaking the game, but it didn't matter. Half-Life 2, the game that was shrouded in mystery for years, had leaked onto the internet. Known as the Half-Life 2 beta, it began to circulate, and it quickly made people aware of how far behind the game was to completion. In October of 2003, Newell publicly explained the leak and requested help finding out who was behind it. Because of the leak, it left Newell and his development team shattered. They wondered if they could go on. Morale at the company was at an all-time low. The game was delayed, but the team continued to push forward. Newell's plea for help and the FBI were unable to locate the perpetrator. In February of 2004, Genbei sent Newell an email admitting he was the guy behind the hack, and provided proof by this by attaching files that were only available on Valve servers. Genbei felt remorse for his actions and tried to turn it into a positive for himself. As he conversed with Newell, Genbei asked if he would consider giving him a job at Valve. It was his dream to work for a development company, and he had hoped that his hacking and programming skills would get him employment by the company that he idolized. Newell responded a few days later, saying yes to the interview. The first would be a phone interview where he'd chat with some of the Valve team for 40 minutes. They asked him about the hacking, which he admitted to, and explained to the Valve staff how he pulled it off. Genbei thought the interview went rather well. A few days later, Newell reached out to Genbei again and asked him for a second interview. This time it would be at Valve HQ in Seattle, but Newell had never planned on giving Genbei a position, rather having him arrested at the airport in the United States for his numerous criminal offences. Genbei never flew to the USA, fortunately for him. He was arrested in Germany, but the German authorities knew who Genbei already was, as his name was connected to other vulnerabilities at the time. In the end, Genbei did 2 years probation for his crimes. Half-Life 2 was delayed for over a year before finally releasing in November of 2004. The Half-Life 2 leak, while buggy and unfinished, was a fascinating insight into the development of the game. Valve refused to acknowledge and speak on it, but the general tone of the leak was that it was much darker than the final product. It was said that Valve deliberately moved away from this iteration of the game due to the leak, but this is simply untrue. In fact, they had already moved away from many of the storyline elements before the leak even occurred. In the end, Gabe Newell wanted his team to develop the best game ever, and Half-Life 2 was perfection. The 2004 Game of the Year, it exceeded all expectations and is one of the best games ever made. As for Axel Gembe, by all accounts, he regrets what he did, and he wished it never happened. He claims that he was young and naive, and he only wanted to get closer to his heroes. But the Half-Life 2 leak will go down as one of the most brazen hacks in all of video game history.
The right man in the wrong place can make all the difference in the world.
So there you have it, guys. That is the Half-Life 2 leak of 2003. A very brazen and very interesting tale to go back and revisit. And probably the most high-profile leak in the history of video games. It's definitely up there with the biggest of them all. But I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what you thought about this video. And if you liked it, you know what to do. Leave me a thumbs up. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.